Good evening, everyone. I'm the storyteller, and I am here to help you sleep better with true horror stories. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and like my video. I would love to know where you are from and what time you're watching this video. So please leave a comment to let me know, and I will draw from that experience to tell even better stories. When you are ready, feel free to relax. I wanted to take a few days off after graduating from high school, because it was my last week before starting college. I wanted to go camping alone, which is something I love to do, but this time it would be different from all the others because instead of an outdoor adventure, what awaited me was the scariest experience of my life. About 2 hours away from my town, there was a large, dense forest that was popular with campers, but fortunately, it was a little lonely during that season, so it was ideal for me at that time because I only wanted to spend a few days alone, enjoying the peace that nature provides, and disconnecting from the outside world before beginning this new, significant phase of my life. However, what I would discover there would be completely different. That day, I went into the forest at around 6 o'clock in the morning. And after 4 hours of walking through this rocky and uneven terrain, I finally found the ideal spot to set up my camp. It was close to a stream, but far from the usual trails rather than. I had to clear some space and remove enough undergrowth to be able to set up my tent and build my campfire because it was quite damp. And this took some time. By the time I realized it was getting dark, I had to rush to get everything ready before I ran out of light that night. So I had a can of tuna and crackers for dinner and went to bed early because I was pretty exhausted from the hike and all the work it took to set up camp. But as soon as I put my head on the pillow, or rather, the backpack I use as a pillow, I fell asleep. I've had severe insomnia since I was a child, and one of the reasons I love camping is that, to me, the sounds of the forest at night are almost therapeutic. While most people have some anxiety or fear when they hear trees, wind owls, and wild animals prowling around at night, I find that they help me relax, and I usually sleep like a baby whenever I do this. In a terrifying and somewhat strange dream, I woke up in the morning and went to the creek to fetch some fresh water. However, as I got closer, I noticed a red-haired, curly-haired girl who was barefoot and wearing a dress that appeared to be from a bygone era. She was bending down on her back, collecting water in a small pot, and I got a little closer to her because I wanted to know who she was. After I was about 2 meters away, she slowly turned her face and gave me a small smile. Incredibly attractive, with a freckle-filled face and large blue eyes. I returned the smile, but as I was about to ask her name, I saw that her face started to change in a spooky way. Her pupils darkened and turned a deep black, which gradually ate away at the blue in her eyes until they formed 2 black wells that filled the entire eye socket. At the same time, his face paled until it turned grayish-white, with tiny black veins starting to appear, and his mouth opened inhumanely, and he abruptly emitted inhuman. For a moment, I was deafened by a terrible shriek that sounded like a whistle, but louder and sharper. It was a sound that made my body freeze. I woke up abruptly, and when I opened my eyes, I noticed that I was perspiring and that my heart was racing. It had been a terrible nightmare, so I quickly sat up and left the tent. I went to the creek to get some fresh water, and I couldn't help but think about the nightmare I had just moments before. I felt a chill all over my body, but I quickly recovered, thinking it was just a silly nightmare. So I got my water and went back to the tent to boil it and make myself a sandwich. After breakfast, I decided to take a short walk around the area because I had never been this far into the forest and I wanted to explore. I didn't know where I was going because it wasn't on the map, but since I had nothing better to do that second day, I thought it was a good plan. As I was walking, I noticed that there was a small path of stones that was barely discernible because it was hidden. I wanted to follow it through the undergrowth to see if it led to a cool spot, a small pond, a waterfall, or something similar. I packed a backpack with food and water in case I ended up being out longer than I had anticipated. I walked for several miles along the trail, which was extremely narrow, had too much brush in many places, and showed no signs of people, such as shoe prints or anything else. At least 2 hours had passed before I arrived at the trail's destination, but it was completely different from what I had anticipated. rather than a waterfall or some natural scenery. I found an abandoned house, or rather an old cabin, in the middle of the forest, covered in moss and grass, and reeking of rotten wood. The doors and windows were all open, but before I got any closer, I checked to see if anyone else was there, because this was not your typical situation, just stumbling in the middle of the forest. A house in the middle of nowhere is not something you expect, and this was not on the map either. I went to the door and peered inside to look down the main hallway, where there was mold and animal droppings all over the floor, but oddly, the house was furnished with items that appeared to be very old and deteriorated over time, as well as by the wild animals that had undoubtedly visited it frequently. In the living room, there was wooden furniture that was covered in mold and filthy, and there was a table with 4 chairs, a wooden shelf with items still on top, an old wood stove, and some shelves were also on the floor. A couple of rusty metal pots that immediately reminded me of the one I had seen in the girl's hands in the dream were also there. This disturbed me a little, but I try not to let it bother me because I wanted to keep exploring the place, and I had to set aside my paranoia. I crawled through the 2 rooms, each of which had a bunk bed and a sort of closet. This area of the house was nearly entirely in ruins, to the point where my foot once went through the rotten wood and I nearly broke a leg. I knew I had seen enough and started to leave right away before the place collapsed on me. But as I was ready to leave the old, ruined house, something powerfully caught my attention. A small shoe lying in the corner of one of the rooms. One of them was completely destroyed, and there was a pile of fabrics on the floor that I assumed were once clothes. I happened to see it by chance and couldn't help but think of the girl from the dream again. So I went over and picked it up. It was made of leather and appeared to be belonging to a boy or girl who was no older than 7. It seemed too intriguing not to keep it in my backpack as a memento of that unexpected and strange discovery in the middle of the forest. After that, I hurried out of the house, and when I noticed that it had been a while, I briefly considered continuing the tour, but for some reason, I decided against it. I made the decision to return to the camp, but as soon as I stepped outside the cabin, the front door, which was wide open, slammed shut. This made me jump because of the loud noise it had made. I would be lying to you if I said it didn't make me a little afraid, but I thought it had been the wind because the door was unlocked, so it would only take another windstorm to open again. I kept that explanation in order to be able to leave quietly, but that did not occur because I had barely walked a few meters before I heard footsteps behind me. Were not loud footsteps, but they were audible, and I could even hear the sound of leaves being trampled. At first, I was a little uneasy because I hadn't seen anyone there, so I started looking around to see who I was following, but there was only forest. I tried to remain composed and continued walking, thinking that perhaps it was the echo of my own footsteps. The fact that I was a little anxious about the door in the house and everything else. I didn't stop listening to the footprints all around me. When I got there, I placed the backpack down, started the campfire, and heated some water to make instant soup. I then sat by the fire to wait. It was 4 p.m. When I sat by the fire, the footsteps ceased, and I stayed calm, assuming that it had undoubtedly been the echo of my own footsteps that I had heard on the road. However, as I was eating my instant soup, I heard the same footsteps all around me once more, and this was beginning to get to me. A shiver went through my body, but I tried not to think much of it and just pretended nothing was happening. However, it was no longer just footsteps. Instead, it sounded like they were moving the tree branches. I looked up to see if there were any monkeys or anything to explain this, because if it was the wind, all the trees would be moving, not just 1 or 2 nearby, but there were none. It soon grew dark, and I was so tense and restless at that point that I made the decision to enter the tent as soon as possible. I switched on my solar-powered lamp and started reading one of the books I had brought because I like to read a small book before bed. For a few hours, everything was as usual. So I focused on the book and forgot about the earlier tasks, but by 8 p.m., since I was in the middle of nowhere by myself and could not afford to chill out, I had to summon all my remaining courage and leave the tent with my flashlight in hand. I heard footsteps again, this time around my tent, and instantly became restless. I had a really unsettling feeling in my body at this point, and I knew that this was not normal and that it was not just the sounds of the forest. I began to look around again to see if I saw anyone, but I was unsure of what was worse than that. Nobody was outside my camp, and the footsteps had stopped for a while, but when I returned to my tent, the footsteps resumed, and this time it seemed like someone was jumping around. I was terrified, but I didn't know what to do, so I just closed my eyes and began praying, pleading with God to take whatever was out there away from me. However, something even more terrifying occurred. Began hearing a laugh, a kind of mocking laugh, and the creepiest part was that it was a child's or girl's laugh. At that moment, the little girl from the dream returned to my mind, and I wondered if it was actually her. Could it be the little girl I dreamed about? Believe me, this thought scared me twice as much, because if that girl was the demonic specter I saw in my dreams in real life, I would have had a heart attack if she showed up. Thank God, though, and I continued to hear her laugh all night long. Her laughter and footsteps were all over the place. So at one point, I just put my head in my sleeping bag to avoid looking at anything, because there was nothing I could do. I didn't have any supernatural abilities to fight spirits or souls in pain. And I couldn't escape, and it was night, so I had to wait until at least dawn to be able to leave the forest. The following day, I was awakened by the sunlight creeping into my tent. There was no more laughter, no more footsteps, and so I hurriedly began gathering everything. I was certain that it was the same girl from my dream for some reason, so I quickly removed the shoe and placed it at the base of a tree. After finishing up my packing and leaving the area as quickly as I could, I realized that the little shoe I had found in the abandoned house was the reason the girl had followed me to the camp. That was the fastest camping trip I had ever taken in my life. 2 days was all it took for me to flee that location, and when I finally made it home, when I told my parents that I was surprised to return so quickly and that I wasn't feeling well, they asked me what had happened. That same day, I started looking up information online to see if I could learn anything about that old cabin in the middle of the woods. But all I could find was the account of another camper who had a similar experience to mine some 15 years prior. But he was also unable to learn anything about that location, which is really odd in the internet age. Although I have returned, I now only stay in the main camps because I'm afraid of experiencing such an event, music again. When I was a child, there was an abandoned house just down the street from me, and it makes me a little sad to think that that girl may have been the victim of something very bad. I hope it's not the case, and it's just my conjecture. Anyway, I will never camp in that area of the forest again. Of terrifying tales, and we children were certain that the place was haunted. The house had been vacant for roughly 20 years, or since the 1970s, because it was 1995 when I was 7 years old. This house was entirely different from the others in the area because it was a massive Renaissance-style structure that, according to the adult story, belonged to a very wealthy man who purchased multiple urbanist homes and demolished them to create this mansion. However, at some point, I'm not sure how he lost all of his money, but the likelihood is that. I'm not sure that this was actually the case, but I do know that the house was abandoned for a very long time and that everyone claimed it was haunted. Many even claimed to have heard voices and seen ghosts there. One day, my friends and I spoke to an older boy who had allegedly been inside the house and told us a story. He was shot dead in the study of that house, and after his death, his entire estate was placed in probate because he had no heirs, so the house was completely empty. About how the old mansion was filled with satanic symbols and even a sacrificial altar in the center of the living room. All of us kids were afraid of it and never dared to approach it. I know he was playing tricks on us, but as a 7-year-old, this scared me so much that one day I would live my own horror story in that house, though not exactly because it was haunted. The kids in my neighborhood used to play soccer almost every afternoon in the middle of the street, and we kicked the ball a lot. That day, a group of us kids had been playing soccer all afternoon. I had just scored a touchdown and was picked to kick a field goal. We had an old metal fence in that neighborhood, so most of the houses had these metal fences that ended in arrowheads. Sometimes we had to jump over the fences, and other times the ball ended up going flat. It was a real nightmare, especially when there was no other ball. The team set up the structure we used as an alcove, but it was stuck in the corner of the field, and we had to drag it to use it. It was obviously too close. But kids don't always think things through before they do them. The problem is that I was about to make an incredible play, but when I kicked the ball, it passed millimetrically between the bars of the old mansion, and I watched helplessly and almost in slow motion as the ball went through one of the glass windows of the windows at the top of the house, knowing that there was nothing I could do to stop it. At that point, everything was gone, and all the kids made gestures like, "What crap?" before leaving the place, with the exception of the boy who owned the ball because he had just bought it a few days prior, and it was a birthday present. He knew he would have major issues if he did not bring the ball home with him, and he didn't have to say anything to know it. He was crying. They were starting to fall down his face at that point. I could have simply said I'm sorry and let him die, but that's not my style, so I found the courage to go up to him and tell him I would go get his ball back, but based on his reaction, I'm sure this scared him even more than getting into trouble with his parents. I'm sure that in his mind, he seriously considered leaving him where he was, but he knew he had no other option. So as he choked back the tears, he nodded and like a couple of. When we reached the back door, we turned the handle to see if it was locked with keys, but to our surprise, it wasn't. Fortunately, the lace curtains were light enough to let in the light so that we could enter without wasting any time. Soldiers going to war knowing they would not return alive. We bravely headed for certain death in that terrifying place. This was done by jumping the gate and entering through the back to avoid being seen by the gossiping neighbors. As the boy we spoke with had told us, we could see all the horrors inside that haunted place, including the satanic graffiti, candles, altar of sacrifices, and everything else, including the sacrificial altar. To our surprise, however, we discovered that none of this was there. In fact, the house was nearly intact except for the white sheets covering the furniture and the dust that had accumulated over the years. Once I realized that this guy had deceived us, I truly felt a great curiosity to explore that place, but my partner was still afraid, and I was fascinated by everything around me, especially the old photos. It was clear that my friend wanted to leave as soon as possible, so I decided to listen to him, and we hurried up to the second floor, which was similar to the second floor except for a very sickening smell. Other than that, everything was normal, and all the rooms were open. So I looked at some of them prior to beginning the search, and they were very opulent and roomy. But aside from that, they appeared normal and not at all ghostly. However, one of the rooms at the end of the hallway was closed, and since we were unsure of the ball's location, we began searching several rooms, none of which had it, even though they all appeared to have windows with their glass intact. It was then that we realized the ball had most likely fallen exactly in the room at the end. We went there without giving it much thought because we needed to get the ball back as soon as possible. When we opened the door, we discovered that the pain had gotten so bad that we had to cover our noses with our t-shirts. However, when we looked at the window, we saw that one of the large windows was broken because it was allowing air to pass through the curtains, which were moving in the breeze. We began searching the entire room for the ball, and when I eventually found it, it was lying next to a huge closet. When I turned to see what was happening, I heard a shrill scream behind me. My friend was pointing to something on the floor on the other side of the bed with one hand over his mouth. And when I went to look at it, I was really startled to see that a man was lying down next to the bed. He was wearing jeans and a dark sweater, and he was lying on his side with one arm covering his face. He appeared to be asleep, but I couldn't figure out why he had chosen the floor rather than the bed because we both remained motionless and waited for him to move, but he didn't for a moment. I realized that he was the cause of the foul odor, so I slowly went up to him, grabbed him by the sweater sleeve, and tried to pull his arm away from his face so I could look at it. But it was too stiff and I couldn't move it, but I could see a portion of his face which I will never forget because it reminded me of the zombie movies my parents occasionally watched. Decomposing after that, I lost my temper and began screaming at the top of my lungs, "He's dead, he's dead," as I ran down the stairs at full speed with my friend following closely behind, equally or more terrified than I was, and screaming like crazy. We didn't stop until we were outside the house, and when we caught our breath, we realized that we had left the ball behind, and none of us wanted to return there. In addition, we noticed that several neighbors had come out in response to our screams. After telling my parents what we had discovered, they promptly dialed 911 and everyone went home. Later, as I sat in my room, staring out the window, I watched the police enter and exit the house. As the paramedics removed the man's body, a police officer, holding a soccer ball, came over and spoke to us for a while. I told him the ball was mine, and he gave it to me. We thanked him, and he left a few days later. Paragraph about our mob discovery in the newspaper. Since the day of the discovery, we kids have been speculating about a variety of terrible and sinister reasons why this person died. But in the end, it turned out to be a simple overdose at the age of 7. This seemed like a huge disappointment to me, and most of us quickly went back to our normal lives. Though I had a few nightmares about that poor guy, but it wasn't any more traumatic than that. As for the others, they promptly forgot about it and didn't. My friend claimed that his parents had once asked him if he had anything to do with what was in the paper, but he may have been wise enough to play dumb and let it go. He never told his parents about that affair, and I doubt they ever realized how close my friend came to losing that ball forever. The event I'm about to tell you about is the scariest thing I have ever experienced, and I still get nightmares about it occasionally. It happened 12 years ago when I was in high school. Until now, Albert and I have kept this to ourselves, primarily because we are unaware of the true events that took place there. I first met Albert in elementary school, and we have been best friends ever since. One of the things we have in common is our love of exploring abandoned places, which is not unusual for boys, but in our case, we took it very seriously. We were like two suburban Indiana Joneses, constantly seeking out new experiences and places to explore. This hobby began when we went on a field trip to an old, dilapidated house in our school for a history class. I remember the first time Albert and I went exploring in an abandoned house in his neighborhood, followed by a couple of ruined churches and even a power plant that had been closed, but we were pulled out by the police because some local neighbors called them, believing us to be thieves or addicts, or as one woman told us. The reason for this is unclear, but some sources claim that the project's investor ran out of money, while others claim that the state decided to halt construction because of irregularities in the permits. Regardless, we have been discussing visiting an abandoned mall on the outskirts of our city for a while. The truth is that this building had been abandoned for over 25 years. Albert and I were so excited about the prospect of visiting that we packed a few items into a bag and drove Albert's father's old truck to get there. The mall was situated on the side of a long road, but the state had blocked the view from the road with a large row of trees, most likely to keep people from seeing this old, dilapidated building so close to the city. The highway leading to the parking lot was also. We had to park on the side of the road and encircle ourselves with trees to keep passing cars from seeing us. The sun was going to set, so we had enough light to walk around the trees. After a few minutes, the sound of cars driving by on the highway stopped altogether, and we arrived at the edge of the massive, deserted, and ruined parking lot where the abandoned shopping mall was. Upon closer inspection, we discovered that the building was much larger than it appeared, and this would undoubtedly be an amazing feat of engineering. But what was most mysterious was that it was nearly finished. There were no cars, no people, no noises, just us. We stood there for a moment to make sure we were truly alone, and then we entered the main entrance through the parking lot and saw that all of the glass doors were broken. As soon as we entered, it almost instantly grew darker. At first, we were silent, moving slowly and taking in our surroundings. It was really eerie to be in this enormous mall, walking without anyone or lights. Every step we took on the way to the center reverberated throughout the building, creating a truly unsettling atmosphere. As we were walking down one of the aisles, we paused for a moment to retrieve our flashlights from the bag we were carrying when we heard an odd sound, like someone laughing. We began to investigate the source, and it appeared to be coming from the opposite end of the mall, which was completely dark. However, after a few minutes, we heard nothing more and saw nothing else. So we both agreed that it had to be just another group exploring the area, which I didn't like at all because we wanted to avoid bumping into other people, but we were already there and couldn't waste time. In addition, it was getting late to head back, so we continued towards another area of the building that seemed to be the darkest of all. As we adjusted the lights, we discovered that every store was completely empty, were deserted, and trash and graffiti were everywhere. By that time, the sun had undoubtedly set because, when I turned to look behind us, the area from which we had come was also completely dark. I turned to tell Albert, but he had stopped moving and was holding his flashlight firmly aimed at something in front of us. I whispered to him, and he appeared to be frozen, staring at nothing. However, when I looked closer, I saw that his light was pointing far down the hallway and right in front of us, and I also froze. The thing that scared us the most, I believe, was that this figure was completely motionless. It never made an attempt to greet us, speak, or simply move away. Instead, it just stood there. Although we couldn't see its eyes due to the darkness and distance, its face was pointing straight at us, so we knew it was staring at us. As the seconds went by, my heart felt like it was about to explode out of my chest. There, I whispered to Albert, "Let's leave," and he finally responded by turning off the light from that person, or whatever it was. We both turned around and began walking swiftly back to our starting point, swinging our lights constantly as we made our way through the darkness out of concern that we would trip over something or someone. At one point, we heard footsteps behind us, so we accelerated, but then we heard another set of. We were terrified and began running in the dark when we heard footsteps in one of the side corridors that appeared to be coming our way. When we realized that the footsteps were following us, Albert pointed backwards with his flashlight while I continued to point forward to avoid tripping or falling. However, even though we could hear the footsteps coming close behind us, we were unable to see anyone behind us. We focused our flashlight multiple times, but at no point did we see anything, not even a silhouette. Albert and I ran through dark, empty hallways until we finally saw the exit door about 10 or 15 meters away. Then, we heard footsteps getting closer and closer, as if they were going to reach us, so we ran as fast as we could and left them all behind. The most bizarre part of this is that as soon as we stepped outside the building, the footsteps stopped and there was only the sound of the breeze and the distant cars. Albert quickly turned on his light again, but we saw nothing at all. Nothing happened. We paused a few meters from the mall's entrance and turned on our lights again, this time using both flashlights, but we were unable to see anything else. Since it was night and there were no headlights, Albert and I decided to run to the exit because we had to cross a large parking lot and a forest before we could reach the truck on the side of the road. We were extremely surprised that we didn't say anything. Word all the way back, and when the time came, we simply said goodbye and went home. We weren't able to discuss it until the following day, but we never told anyone else about it. To this day, nobody in our immediate vicinity is aware of it, but it's something we have never been able to explain musically. In the city where I live, there's a hotel that has been abandoned for decades. They had purchased it multiple times before, but each time they went bankrupt after a few years. Since this town is small and lacks a tourist destination, that must be the cause. It is hard to imagine who would invest so much money in a project of that magnitude in a city that receives almost no tourists and where more people leave than arrive. Additionally, this hotel was enormous, with 6 floors and a nearly enormous area. You could say that it is the largest building in the entire city. Why was apparently never a very profitable business and always ended up going out of business always piqued my curiosity, and at the age of 23, I simply made the decision to go and look at it. I genuinely believe that there was nothing frightening or dangerous about it. It was just an old, deserted building that would be great to explore and discover what was there. I had considered doing this for years, but this time I worked up the nerve to go. I chose to go during the day because I reasoned that if anyone was there, it would likely be inquisitive, harmless individuals like me who were just there to explore. I parked at a store that was half a mile away and headed to the... When I first arrived, I noticed that the hotel itself looked much worse than the last time I'd seen it. The bricks were crumbling and the entire place seemed to be discoloring and decaying. It was practically isolated on the side of the road because most of the surrounding stores had already been demolished because this was the oldest area of the city and there was less commercial life than before. I walked up the small steps to the entrance and looked inside the building, which still had its framed glass doors, but they had no security. So it was essentially open to the public, and anyone could come in and see it. As I mentioned earlier, I examined the interior and noticed that it was nearly empty, with only a few items scattered about, such as chairs and old furniture. I entered the hallway and opened the staircase door. The entire staircase was dark, and the only light I could see was a dim beam from one of the upper floors, but it was enough to guide me to the stairs. But when I got to the second floor door, something on the opposite side was blocking it from opening, and a piece of wood covered the door's window. It was unfortunate, but I chose to go on to the third floor, where Flo opened the door and entered the hallway. This was probably the creepiest situation I've ever encountered on this particular day. The hallway was musty and dark, with only a small window at each end to provide light. I walked a little before entering the first room, which had an oddly open door. As I continued down the hallway, I noticed that several rooms had unlocked doors. I went into some of them and was surprised to find that many of them were intact, just like the first one I saw. There were layers of dust covering everything, but all the furniture was upstairs as if it had never been moved, and there were even towels and soap left in the bathroom, even though this gave the impression that it was somewhat fossilized, since a lot of people, like me, entered the old hotel to explore it. I decided to head back to the stairs to go to the next floor after checking all the rooms on that floor. However, as I was walking back, I heard someone turn the knob on the door to the hallway. I wasn't sure if the sound was coming from the floor I was on or from the floor below, because if someone was opening that door, they must have gone up the stairs first, but I never heard anyone climbing. As I kept my eyes on the door, I noticed that it started to open slowly, making that sound so characteristic of wooden doors when opening. But because it was so dark, I was unable to tell who was behind it. It seemed very strange to me, because these were iron stairs, and since the building was completely empty, every time you go up a step, your footsteps rumble and are heard very clearly everywhere. When someone entered, the door was only partially open before slamming shut, but with such force that it seemed to have been thrown. My heart was racing, but not just because of the knock on the door. I could also hear slow, crawling footsteps that sounded loudly on the wooden floor. It took me a few seconds to recognize the sound, but I did. It was the sound of a cane. The issue was that I couldn't see anyone I was standing in. I was frozen in place, staring straight ahead as the footsteps slowly approached, trying to control my nerves. The only thing that came to mind at the time was to say hello, but no one responded. Instead, the footsteps continued to move forward at the same pace, and as they got closer, I could tell that it was an older person's walk, but I was unable to identify any figures in the darkness. Reached the center of the hallway, where if it was a person, I should have been able to see it fairly clearly, because it was only 6 or 7 meters from me. However, the hallway appeared to be completely deserted, and all I could hear were footsteps coming toward me. At that moment, my blood was freezing, and I was helpless to do anything but stand there frozen in place, while whatever was in the hallway continued to move forward and get closer and closer until the steps finally reached me. Something happened that I never would have thought of, and they just stopped. I stood for a few more seconds, frozen in place, my heart pounding 1,000 beats per minute, and I had no idea what was happening. But after a moment, I just walked as quickly as I could, crossed the hallway, opened the door, went down the stairs, and left the place at full speed without turning around. When I reached the street, I quickly went back to my car and sat in the parking lot for a while. Looking back, that was probably the scariest thing I have ever experienced in my life. And going to that hotel by myself was the dumbest thing I have ever done. I never talked to anyone about it, and I didn't try to figure out who the spirit wandering the hotel's halls might be. But I never went back there. Music. My brothers and I grew up in a humble house in a small Mexican town that was very close to the US border. At the time, the house across the street lived as somewhat troubled. My brothers and I occasionally went out to play with a middle-aged couple who had a 7-year-old son. However, things in that home could get so violent at times that the police had to step in on a few occasions. The arguments in that marriage were frequent, and there was a lot of verbal abuse. I recall that the woman left the house multiple times with her son, but she always returned for some reason. This situation continued for years, and eventually we all grew accustomed to hearing it. I used to wake up late on Saturdays because I didn't have school, but on this particular Saturday, things just went to a whole new level. I was awakened by screams coming from the house across the street, and my parents and a few other neighbors came out to see what was going on. Then, we saw the woman hurling her belongings out of the house and yelling obscenities at her husband. It appeared that she had discovered what was happening. That day that her husband was with another woman and had another family really drove Mrs. Claudia crazy. The man eventually packed up his belongings and left the house. But she locked herself in Finn, and we didn't see her again for a few days. It was strange because she went outside every morning to water the garden in front of her house. But everyone thought she was too depressed to be watering plants. On Monday morning, however, the husband came home as usual, most likely to make. After knocking multiple times without anyone answering, Mr. Leandro decided to force the door open and enter the house. This is when he discovered one of the most horrifying scenes I can recall. 2 bodies hanging from the ceiling in the living room. One was that of his wife, and the other was that of his 7-year-old son. The man emerged from the house, screaming frantically and sobbing in desperation. We all went outside to see what had happened to him, but it wasn't necessary. It was devastating for Mr. Leandro, who 3 days later did the same thing as his wife in the same location. This is one of the most unsettling memories I have of my childhood in my small town. After this unfortunate and chilling event, the house remained unoccupied for a long time until a family was the only ones who had lived there after 5 years. He explained what happened because he had left the door open and we could see the macabre scene from outside. The tragedy caused a lot of impact in the town when it occurred. But over time, it was forgotten and hardly ever discussed until a few months ago when this terrible story came back into the public due to a terrifying incident. They rented the property, but they did not even last a week because they were unaware of what had happened. The real estate agency never told them. When they learned from the neighbors, they immediately left the property. Since then, no one else has lived there. Event that featured my kids and my nephews as the main characters. Last December, I invited all of my siblings to spend Christmas at my house. My family is large. I have 7 siblings, 15 nieces and nephews, and 2 sons. My sons and nephews are all around the same age, between 12 and 18, and as you may know, kids do a lot of dumb things at that age. Nevertheless, on Christmas Eve, we all celebrated together and had a great time, and the adults had a few drinks and enjoyed the evening dancing and conversations. Enjoying themselves, the children went to the street to play with their neighbors, while the older children interacted with children their own age. However, the older children went to bed at around 2 in the morning. In spite of the fact that my town is quite quiet, the younger ones stayed up playing video games and enjoying themselves with one another. The following morning, however, we were startled by a flurry of cries and screams that could be heard in the middle of the street, so I hastily got up and left. I rushed outside to see what was going on when I arrived at the door and saw my oldest son and several of my nephews making a commotion in the street. They were sobbing in terror and the girls were yelling uncontrollably, so I went to investigate. Suddenly, I noticed that the front door of the old, abandoned house was wide open, and they were directly in front of it. I hurried over and asked them what had happened, and they started telling me, still in desperation and tears, that night after we went to bed. They took a couple of bottles of tequila from the ones that were still on the table and slipped out of the house to drink without us noticing, as if the drunkenness and alcohol breath could be covered up. However, my nephews observed that the house was deserted and chose to enter through one of the windows to have their small party there. Since they're not from here, they had no idea what the house's history was. To continue the story, my oldest nephew claimed that after having a few drinks, they became inebriated and immediately fell asleep on the floor of the living room. However, when they woke up that morning, they were confronted by a terrifying scene. When they opened their eyes, they saw 3 bodies hanging from the ceiling directly above them. The bodies were those of a man, a woman, and a child. The boys went out into the street, screaming and crying, telling their neighbors what they had witnessed and calling the police. However, they were unaware that this did not occur that night. Rather, it occurred 35 years ago, and that these were not flesh and bones, but three unfortunate. I told the children this story, and later we all went to the house with lots of candles and formed a prayer circle to help the souls of my former neighbors reach eternal peace. They discovered that there was nothing there when they left the house, despite the fact that they were apparently still bound to this world to which they no longer belong. I hope your day is filled with health and joy. I invite you to subscribe to my channel to hear true horror stories. Hello, and see you again.